It's the Germans who seem to do it in a more spectacular way than anyone else. And then when we get to the 19th century, we have these romantic movements in different countries. But again, it's Nietzsche who is like the most prominent of the leaders of this sort of non-Christian romantic movement. Someone once said that Romanticism is a halfway house, where between Catholicism on the one end and complete nihilism on the other end.
Welcome to another episode of the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Bobby Mixa. Unfortunately, Andrew Petiprin could not be with us this week again because of scheduling issues. Summer is a hard time to get a podcast in, but I'm very happy to have with us the great Tracey Rowland, Dr. Rowland. Dr. Rowland, many of you are already familiar with because of her work with Pope Benedict XVI and also many of her books on Vatican II and communal theology. I saw Dr. Rowland in Krakow a couple of months ago when they just published her book, Catholic Theology, into Polish. So we had a nice time to meet up at a little cafe and chat a little bit. But I'm just so honored to have Dr. Rowland on. Many of you already know that she was the winner of the Ratzinger Prize. And she just continues to publish and publish and publish. And I just saw she has a new book out that she co-edited on the philosophy that is behind many of the works of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. So anyways, I just want to welcome Dr. Rowland. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Always, enjoy chatting to you and other people associated with the Space Salvi Institute. So thank you.
Thank you. A couple of months ago, your commencement address at the Christendom College actually made quite a splash. So I want to focus a little bit on that because I thought it really, as Larry Chapp said, it was really a call to arms. And I loved it that you underlined the theme of spiritual warfare, preparing students for this world that they will be going into. But more particularly, when you got to the section on John Paul II, and Pope Benedict XVI, and really delving into their legacy, you actually underline here something I thought was really, really interesting. The need they have to delve into the tradition of German philosophy. I particularly took that as actually German idealist tradition. So
yes,
what struck me though is what did you have in mind when you recommended that to the students?
Well, I think that there's a tendency today for some students to think that we just need to go back to the medieval era and not really engage in any of the work of the modern philosophers. And I think that's a problem because if we want to understand secularization, if we want to understand any of the problems we have in the contemporary world, I think we need to understand the intellectual history of the last 5 centuries. And I think a lot of that intellectual history has come out of Germany. So the Reformation broke in Germany. I mean, there were some rumblings in Bohemia, but preceding, I think, Luther. But, the Reformation really broke in Germany. And then when we come to the 18th century, yes, there were philosophers in Scotland, in England, in France, a whole new generation of people wanting to separate reason and faith from one another. But it's the Germans who seem to do it in a more spectacular way than anyone else. And then when we get to the 19th century, we have these romantic movements in different countries. But again, it's Nietzsche who is like the most prominent of the leaders of this sort of non-Christian romantic movement. Someone once said that Romanticism is a halfway house, where between Catholicism on the one end and complete nihilism on the other end. So I think that then when we come to the 1960s, it's like a perfect storm explosion of Kant, Nietzsche, Marx, Freud. Freud was an Austrian, but Kant, Nietzsche, Marx, they were all Germans. And so I think that in order to understand where we are now, we have to understand what happened intellectually in those years. We have to understand those projects.
Yeah.
And the person who really got it, I think, was Benedict, because he was German. Wojtyła got it too, but in a really deep way, I think that Ratzinger understood it. And so that's why I was saying to the students, look, it's not just resetting the whole intellectual tradition to the 13th century. We have to understand what happened in the past 5 centuries. And if you go to Wojtyła and you go to Ratzinger, you find people who engaged with those intellectual upheavals, intellectual revolutions.
Yeah.
And it'll help you to understand your own situation in the world.
Yeah. When I studied philosophy in undergrad level, and particularly at the institution I was at, they put a pretty heavy emphasis on modern philosophy, even though the program prior to probably 1968 was well known for its studies in Aquinas, and it actually had still to this day has a pretty good medieval philosophy program. But I remember talking to a professor at a pretty well-known, faithful, like Newman listed college about the need to study modern philosophy. And the professor remarked kind of in a flippant way that, that's actually, there's no need to study that. We know what Descartes got wrong. It's just pretty much, he didn't put it this way, but a waste of time. And I remember thinking, because around this time I was reading the works of Charles Taylor, and I had some problems with Charles Taylor, but at the same time I appreciated the engagement with the, if you want to say, modern philosophy and romanticism for understanding. I think the title of the book that I was reading at that time was Sources of the Self, Before the Secular Age. But what struck me was how many students coming out of many of these great Catholic universities do not understand the if you want to call it, the modern project. So
exactly.
I really appreciate, this is why it stood out to me. I really appreciated that you underlined that need to engage.
Well, I think there are two things. One is to understand the world we're in. You have to understand those projects. And not everyone has to engage with the intellectual opponents of the church. I don't think everyone has to do that. I think some people have that gift, that charism, that responsibility, but not everyone is called to be an intellectual who, goes out into the world and, engages in intellectual combat with the Nietzscheans on the planet, But some will do that. And of course, they will need to know Nietzsche in order to do that. But the others, I think, need to have a basic grasp of what those projects were, just in order to understand the world into which they have been born, Without that, it's like, I don't know, it's like you're in a culture, but you don't understand it at all. And so I was sort of saying, look, I'm not opposed to Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas, any of the great classical philosophers or medievals. I think it's important to study those too, but don't neglect the moderns, because you cannot understand the culture we're in without understanding at least Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Marx.
Well, you mentioned too in your talk that we're living in a similar time. You quote Christopher Dawson, the famous Catholic historian, sociologist, theologian, I guess, man of all trades, in which he talks about Augustine's city of God. And living in similar times.
Mm.
What is the comparison between our times and the times of Augustine?
I think that the comparison is at least that we're in a time when a civilization is imploding and a new civilization is being born, or it might not be a civilization at all. It might just be a kind of a new form of barbarism. But I think we are in a kind of stage where we're of major change, and many great institutions are just imploding. And I think so. I think Augustine was writing at a time when things were like that, and what Dawson was very good at doing was showing that how Christendom arose on the ashes of the decline of the Roman Empire, and how it was, the Benedictines in particular, setting up these little monasteries throughout Europe, dotting Europe with Benedictine monasteries that became the new force for a Christian civilization, in Europe. And so because the address was delivered at Christendom College, I'm saying, okay, so your college was named Christendom College. And what you need to understand is that Christendom arose not because anyone said, let's build Christendom, but because of these little monastic communities, which were civilizational forces in a very barbaric era. And, so I guess I was sort of saying something similar to what people talk about when they talk about the Benedict option. But if you ask me the question, am I in favor of the Benedict option, I would say I think it's one good thing, but it's not the only option, But
Yeah.
it's one thing that can be done. That is to build Catholic communities around monastic settlements.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing we can do. And the places like Christendom can be little intellectual oases, which are also part of the rebuild of a Christian civilization. John Paul II liked the expression a civilization of love and a culture of life. And I like those expressions too. And so I was sort of trying to affirm them at Christendom and saying, you can be part of this project to build a civilization of love. You can be a very important part of that project, but don't put your head in the sand like an ostrich and think we can just ignore, 500 years of philosophy because it was mostly bad. We need to understand it.
Yeah. And kind of preventing any type of like self-enclosure is important because you see many even graduates of these institutions deciding to, like I know in Steubenville, deciding to live in the locality and still being connected to the institution. At the John Paul II Institute, I remember in the Washington, D.C. area, many graduates decided to stay and they still were connected to institution. So it's important because I think those are fertile grounds for friendships, but friendships grounded in the pursuits of truth, beauty, and goodness. But yeah, making sure that it doesn't become like perhaps maybe a ghetto.
Race or something.
Yeah, is important.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in this talk, you have a quote here from, I'm actually trying to get this one, Charlemagne invited
Elquin.
Yes.
Yeah.
This quote is quite, I never heard this before, about setting up a school in the Carolingian court as being the new Athens that will arise in France.
Yes.
Can you say something about that? Because it's very interesting that he's looking
Well,
back.
I'm not an expert on this period of church history, but what I understand is that there was an English Benedictine monk called Elquin, and that Charlemagne invited him over to his court and said, we need an academy, and we want it to be as great as the academy in ancient Greece, but we think it can be even better because our students will have the benefit of all 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. And therefore we can do something that's even greater than what the Greeks did. And that was just one great French king inviting an English monk to set up, something. And so I think that, that in the 1960s and 70s, when groups of American Catholics went around establishing these liberal arts colleges, because the old Catholic institutions seemed to have kind of lost the plot. The people who did that were really courageous. And I wanted to affirm that and say, look, in the past, similar things have been done. Great things have grown from what seems like a small gesture.
That's right. Yeah, I think about all those colleges like Christendom. You gave this commencement speech being founded.
Yeah.
What went wrong in those Catholic universities?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of factors. I think there's sort of a Catholic inferiority complex in Anglophone cultures, There's often a Protestant establishment and this sort of Catholic need to be seen to be as good as, or to have its institutions recognized as being as good as the institutions of the Protestants. I think that's a part of it. I think it was the 1960s, and so there was a lot of theological chaos, and there still is. There's, the descent over Humane Vitae, and I think a lot of leaders of Catholic academic institutions thought that Humane Vitae was wrong, and that it was an embarrassing decision, and that it would reflect badly upon Catholic academic institutions. And so there was this move to really separate the governance of the universities, the Catholic universities, from the episcopacy, and to really limit the authority of the bishops over the academic institutions. And in many cases, those institutions have just become banal. They're kind of vanilla flavored institutions, and they've become very, very secularized. Not all, but many.
Yeah, and it seems like it's almost a miracle to find someone, professor on campus, who actually perhaps maybe is secretly leading the students to embrace Catholicism. But it's interesting that, around this time in 1968, I believe, when the student protests were going on in Europe, but also in America, that Benedict writes, I believe he writes in 1968, his Introduction to Christianity. And opening up a kind of with the very beginning of that book, it seems like he's having a great overview of the trajectory of philosophy up to the contemporary moment, focusing on kind of techne as being the absolute. So I'm wondering if, with Benedict, his whole career and your work that you've done on Pope Benedict, it seems like he's, in a way, like just with his Regensburg address, is trying to expand that, if you want to say, classical, or return to that classical notion of reason that's then elevated by Christian revelation. But yet he sees, in some ways, he's trying to help Catholics recall the tradition as being, that's coming from Rome, as you mentioned, Athens and Jerusalem, as really being taken up by what you found with people like Alcuin. And it seems like Europe is really at the heart of his, if you want to say, project to recall that and to help Europeans to embrace that tradition again. How do you see that connection between Pope Benedict's work on reason and faith and the university and Europe?
Well, I think, first of all, he insists that the incarnation occurred at a moment in time which was most favorable to a synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem, that it actually occurred at a moment in history when the circumstances were such that a kind of intellectual synthesis of faith and reason, revelation and philosophy was possible. And he refers to the passage, in the New Testament where Paul is having a dream about how he's being asked to go, to go to Greece. And Benedict says, it was important that Paul went to Greece, and that was something providential. And he sees the whole Greek component, the Greek sort of respect for reason and rationality, as being absolutely essential to what Christianity is. And the area or the lecture where he develops that apart from the Regensburg lecture, a place where he also addressed it was in the Sorbonne lecture. In 1999, he was invited to give a lecture at the Sorbonne to celebrate the second millennium. And the lecture was called 2000 Years After What? And in that lecture, he says, Christianity is the religion of the Logos. It claims to be rational. And this is really important about Christianity. And he distinguishes Christianity from other notions of religion and other religions and says it is the religion of the Logos. And so he sees the faith and reason relationship as like a critical couplet that needs to be kept together, not separated. Faith and reason are two distinct things, but they need to be working in tandem. And one of his big criticisms of the liberation theology movement was precisely that it flipped the relationship between logos and ethos. It made praxis more important than doctrine. And he thought that was just a recipe for, destroying the faith. He was very strongly opposed to that. So he certainly saw Christianity as this fusion of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. And some author who does a very good job at explaining that is Remy Brague, who was a Ratzinger Prize winner, I think, quite early on. I can't remember the exact year, but quite early on, Remy Brague was awarded the Ratzinger Prize. And his works, which are available in English, are really good at piecing together this integration of the intellectual legacy of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. So it's really, really important for Benedict. And I think that, unfortunately, because he thought that, people accused him of being Eurocentric. And I think his response would be, no, I'm not Eurocentric. It was a historical fact that these intellectual elements came together in a powerful way in Europe. But any human being anywhere on the planet can appreciate this, And to say that somebody who comes from Africa or Australia or a Pacific island can't appreciate it. It's almost a racist argument. It's like saying humans are different if they come from different countries and their intellectual capacities are different. I find it to be just a really stupid argument, especially, when I grew up in my childhood in outback Australia. I'm just so glad, that the nuns who taught me in school were people who thought that this Christian intellectual heritage, which had grown up in Europe, was worth teaching in outback Australia.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have been left bog ignorant, and there was this treasure that would never have been passed on to me.
That's right.
So, I think Benedict was, in a sense, Eurocentric in this. He was a Bavarian boy. There is a sense in which he was very much a European. And one funny story I'll share with you is that I was told by someone close to Benedict that when he came to Australia for World Youth Day, and I think it's the only time he ever came to Australia, the local zoo appeared at the presbytery with a truck, and they brought out a crocodile, a koala, and a python. Okay. And poor Benedict has to, engage with these animals. And he did cuddle the koala and he patted the python. And then when it came to the alligator, he just said to the zookeeper, "I think the alligator prefers to be with you." But my point is, some poor fellow who's a Bavarian university professor, a scholar, an academic. Even when he was a cardinal, his work was primarily intellectual. And then he kind of lands in Sydney, and then he finds he has to kind of engage with pythons and alligator and crocodiles and koalas, So he did, he kind of rose to the occasion. But the friend of Benedict said to me, in his mind, Australia is associated with being presented with these strange animals. And, obviously, he was a long way from home. Yeah. So in a way, you could say he was very much a European, but his defense of faith and reason, his insistence that these things must be kept together, and that the Greek component of Christianity, what classical Greece offered, was something that was really important and can't just be thrown out the window. In that sense, I don't think he's Eurocentric. I think he just understands the importance of keeping faith and reason together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have cardinals like Cardinal Sarah, who I believe is traveling all over Europe in some ways to remind, the Europeans of this great, intellectual tradition that he is so much embraced. And it's amazing to me too that, of all places, I believe Matthew Levering edited a book on theology in Africa, but Pope Benedict's influence on Africa. So it's to me, it seems just nonsensical to say that he was Eurocentric, but he presented something that everybody up to embrace, and it just happened to take up root in Europe at a particular moment.
I was recently at what the Americans call the University of Notre Dame, Australians say Notre Dame, but Notre Dame. So I was at Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana, and I was at a conference there, and there were 3 African priests who were all brilliant scholars of Benedict. They were totally across the scholarship of Benedict, and they loved him, and they were totally African. They weren't people of African heritage who had been born in the United States. There were people who'd been born in Africa, brought up in Africa, and were African priests and scholars, and they loved Benedict.
Yeah. And it's amazing too how, maybe some of the elements of maybe some remnant paganism or paganism in Africa that maybe Europeans want to embrace, and even some practices that perhaps even like polygamy, many Christian Africans want to move beyond those things. And they see it as actually not necessarily taking up some foreign culture like becoming Europeans, but it's just finding liberation. It's precisely Christ who's giving that.
Yeah. And Cardinal Zara, I'm pretty sure his parents followed some tribal religion. So I think he's a first generation Christian. And so it must be within his family's living memory, the sort of transition from a tribal religion to Christianity. And he's a bit of a superhero, Zara.
Yeah. Oh, definitely for me. In the last part of your commencement address, you mentioned a dinner that you had with one of the last dinners, or
the last dinner.
The last dinner of Cardinal Pell's life, and you said Cardinal.
Well, so it wasn't his last dinner; it was his last dinner party.
Last dinner party, okay. And you also said that Cardinal Zen was there as well. And you mentioned that actually, let me just get the exact line here, that you say if the Americans hold the church can recover from her current crisis if Americans hold firm. Can you maybe expound on that a little bit? If Americans hold firm.
Well, it's one of those things where you don't really want to put words in the mouth of somebody who is now deceased, and but there were a few Americans there at that dinner, and we were all there for the funeral of Pope Benedict. So Pope Benedict's funeral had occurred earlier in the day, and then friends of Cardinal Pell who were in Rome for the Benedict funeral were invited to his home for a kind of dinner afterwards in the evening. And everyone was talking about the state of the church, of course. And the absolute star of the evening was Cardinal Zen, who was then 92 years old. He had to fight a high court case to get permission to leave his country because, of course, the communists are now very influential. And he had to fight a high court case to get allowed out of his country just to attend the Benedict funeral. And like Cardinal Pell, he had been recently imprisoned, in his case because he was supporting the pro-democracy student movement. And so Cardinal Zen, this 92-year-old, I kind of, the thought of long-haul flights is now making me think twice about, do I really want to go to this event, But at 92, he'd fought his way out. He'd got to the event. He turns up at the party and he was just entertaining everyone, with stories that were like what I would call sursum corda stories, lift up your heart, stories that would boost people's morale, and then Cardinal Pell said, look, I think there will be hope for the church, if the Americans just hold firm. And I think by that he meant don't lose the plot, A lot of Catholics in Europe, I think, are losing the plot. They're completely losing the plot in the sense that they seem to think that they can just make it up. They can make up their own religion without any regard to scripture and tradition. So the teachings of the church have foundations, and scripture has always been a foundation. But now we have people, elite Catholics sort of saying things like, well, we don't really know what Jesus said. No one followed Jesus with a tape recorder. So, it's sort of how Jesus related to his context that's important, not really what Jesus is recorded as having said. and I'm sort of at this side of the world thinking, well, then we're at a stage where we're just making it up for ourselves,
Yeah.
And I think that's the sort of thing Cardinal Pell meant. I don't want to, put words into his mouth, but I think that what he meant was like there's a lot of craziness at the moment. It's sort of like a return to the 1960s in some ways, and the Catholic Church in America, I think, is somewhat stronger. It has its problems and it's in no sense united, but I think that in many ways American Catholics are better educated in their faith than European Catholics. I think somehow the catechesis has been done better in the United States. And so I think Cardinal Pell was saying, look, if the Americans hold firm, if they don't lose the plot, then there's some hope we'll come out of this pretty quickly,
Yeah.
But in parts of Europe, the situation is really, really tragic.
Yeah.
Belgium is beyond tragic. They're just selling churches in Belgium.
Do you
So
see, because you were recently in Poland,
mm,
and I being here for like consistently now for a whole entire year, and I've been coming here for about 11, 12 years now. It's interesting, at least in the big cities in Poland, you've and not so much in, say, small towns and the countryside. I'm currently in Podlaskie, my wife's region, which I think is one of the most Catholic areas in perhaps even the world. But still, what you see is, um, okay, I know the priests, they do an excellent job, and also with catechesis is strong. But I remember hearing from a nun, like maybe 5 years ago, who is working out of Warsaw, and she told me she wanted me to come teach something on John Paul II's catechesis on love, the theology of the body. And I said, well, heck, I feel like I should be, learning from somebody here in Poland. But she said, what's interesting is John Paul II, yes, he's a national hero. He is definitely, we all praise him as a saint. But there hasn't been, perhaps in her opinion, I've just got to be careful because I think maybe some Poles wouldn't share this opinion, that his teachings haven't been maybe fully received by the people. And so there's this distance. And I've seen this too, like every day I walk to school, I teach in the center of Krakow, and I'm just sometimes appalled by what I see in the graffiti, like with little disses of John Paul II, and how he's depicted amongst the youth as reducing him to Pramufki and someone that all of their babchas idolize. And so that really is concerning to me. So I wonder what your thoughts are on Poland.
Yeah, I think first of all, I've been told that the history of the fight for freedom is not being taught in Polish schools. That Poland produced an extraordinarily large number of heroic figures in that period of Soviet persecution, and those figures should be, taught in schools. The history of solidarity should be taught in schools. What happened in Poland in the 1980s should be something that every Polish child knows about. Every Polish child should know that Father Popowuszko was the chaplain to solidarity, and that the secret police stopped his car, dragged him from his car, beat him senseless and drowned him in the Wisła River. That every Polish child should know that. And every Polish child should know about Cardinal Wyszynski and the Great Novena, the 10-year Great Novena, which really prepared the way for solidarity. All of that should be taught. And it should be taught as something, we Poles can be proud of. But it seems it's not being taught. And I've been told, and, this is just anecdotal, but I've been told that the narrative is, oh, yes, there was this period when we had this unworkable economic system, and there was a lot of food shortages, and we didn't have any economic freedom. And then finally we joined the European Union, and that problem was sorted. Well, there would have been no joining the European Union had there not been solidarity, Wyszynski, John Paul II, and had not John Paul II entered into an alliance with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev said that. He said if it was not for John Paul II, Poland would, the whole of that Eastern Bloc, not just Poland, but the whole of the Eastern Bloc would still have remained part of Soviet-dominated territory. But John Paul II pulled it free, and he did so, entering into a political alliance with the United States and the UK. Both at the time had leaders who were anti-Marxist.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So that history needs to be taught.
Yeah, I've heard that from many students as well. It's like the food shortages, and my concern is that with this, if you want to say, bourgeois way of life that is in some becoming, like predominant in the big cities, that they may be very soon in a similar situation as many other countries in the West. But there's definitely, I believe, like you mentioned, the Benedictine option, and perhaps maybe there being many other ways, but I think there's a growing number of young Poles, and I know this in Krakow, who do want to, they want to live close to even Tyniec. They want to be close to the church, not in some ways, and in a way cultivating that if you want to say, like, Catholic ethos in the family and the faith, so that eventually, like John Paul II said, to like Noah's Ark, to eventually let it out. But I believe that one of the interesting things that in America that I've noticed, and in your book with particularly folks, shifting back to your book, Beyond Kant and Nietzsche, and you highlighted the importance of German philosophy. And, we talked about the universities in America, and it's interesting too how so many of the universities in America were influenced by German philosophy. And actually, it's interesting. I was reading a book on Nietzsche that mentioned that he was very much interested in the American transcendentalist tradition with Ralph Waldo Emerson. So maybe there's a little bit of an American influence on somebody like the non-Christian romantic Nietzsche. But at the same time, it's interesting that these figures that you mention in this book, I have to say that book, Beyond Kant and Nietzsche, is a book I was very much looking forward to. Then it came out, and I think it was like $120. I'm like, I guess
there's now a paperback.
Okay, good. But the book, I remember immediately read the introduction, and I was fascinated by so many of these figures, these 6 figures that you score. And like many people, I was already familiar with Guardini and with Shivara because of the new translations coming out by like John Betts and David Bentley Hart and some of the other works on Shivara. Which, by the way, Shivara is fascinating to me because his Polish connection and then his connection to Germany. But I'm fascinated that, like, why did you highlight those 6 as being important for even understanding the world in which the giant like Pope Benedict was formed?
Well, I guess I I looked at them because he had said, he had remarked that most of those, he didn't mention Shavara, but he mentioned all the others were quite significant for his intellectual formation. So the way the book came about was I wanted to write the backstory to Benedict. Sometimes when I'm giving talks in parishes, people say to me, how do we produce a Benedict? And it's really hard because you need a certain intellectual culture to produce a Benedict. And so I started writing the book just trying to understand the intellectual culture that could produce a Benedict. And it seemed to me that it was essential to understand Guardini. It was essential to understand Steinbüchel and Surngen because they had been lecturers of his, and their ideas, their theology was hugely influential for him. Heike, he mentioned, Heike being someone seminarians admired because Heike had stood up to Hitler. And to understand Heike, you need to understand the relationship with Karl Muth and the whole Hochland tradition. So I ended up with Muth, Heike, Surngen, Steinbüchel, Shavara, and did I leave anyone out? Guardini, yeah. So I ended up with those 6. And that was about all I could handle. Now, there are some others, I could have thrown into the mix. And I also thought that another book could be written on the philosophers, like people like Pieper, for example, Peter Wust as well.
Mm-hmm. What was the influence of this Austrian philosopher who was very famous for, in a way, highlighting the importance of the word? Something kind of like a I-thou relationship.
Oh, Buber.
Yeah, Buber. But there's also another guy, and there's one translation.
Ebner, Ferdinand Ebner, maybe.
Yes, Ebner. And
yeah.
I think there's one work translated into English by him. But Ebner, the first time I learned about Ebner was in Peter Seyvalt's biography of Pope Benedict, and it's just interesting. So many of these figures and I don't think I'm the only one who's never heard of these figures, but it's very interesting to see this influence on Benedict.
I think that between the 2 world wars, that it was a time of great kind of German Catholic intellectual renaissance. I think there was a lot happening in that period, which was really excellent work. And they were contending with Kant and Marx and Nietzsche, and I think they were doing a really good job. Sadly, the post-war generation just isn't interested in them. And I asked a Bavarian historian, why is this? How can it be that you can have these brilliant men, and they were all opposed to Hitler. None of them were compromised by the Nazi regime. They all, in their own way, resisted. How could you have them, and then all of a sudden 1968 arrives, and your Catholic elite just kind of collapses and gets interested in Frankfurt School social theory? How can that be? And he just said that his reading of it is that the Germans of the generation of 68 needed a narrative to explain how their parents and grandparents could have been so stupid as to get caught up in the whole Nazi movement, and they wanted a narrative that would explain that. And what they did was to buy Theodor Adorno's authoritarian personality thesis. And once you buy into that, you start having a negative attitude toward reason, rationality, conceptions of truth, and also conceptions of hierarchy. And the whole Catholic Church is built on a hierarchy. It's built on the Eucharist, but we have a hierarchy in terms of the governance of the church.
Yeah.
And, if you start applying Frankfurt School social theory to the governance of the church, you end up wanting to dissolve the institutions of the episcopacy, the papacy, and so on.
Yeah.
And so we get generation of 1968 German Catholics, and we now have the situation we have in Germany, where the church is in a really tragic position. I don't know if there are any seminarians at the moment in the great Bavarian archdiocese of Munich, Freising, but just a few years ago, there was one year when one man entered that seminary. They had an intake of one single student.
Wow. It's amazing to me because, people who were perhaps inspired by that Frankfurt school, and having a little bit of, little encounters with them, I've found them to be quite authoritarian. And so it just it's just funny to me that, it's a reaction to the authoritarian personality. But for all things, Pope Benedict was publicly known as God's Rottweiler. But I remember talking to Dr. D.L. Schindler about his meetings with Pope Benedict and how cordial he was, how humble, and any video you watch of him would really make you think otherwise.
Yes.
But it's very interesting because you highlight in that book that they were all trying to flesh out a Christian humanism. And you mentioned even the book by Shivara, 800-page book on Christian humanism. And I hope that gets translated soon.
It's called Humanitas, and it's not all on Christian humanism. What he does is to look at like a large number of philosophers and literary types, and to say, well, what is their vision of the human person? So there are many who were surveyed who were not Christian, so he would look at Nietzsche. What did Nietzsche think of the human person? What did Dostoevsky think of the human person? But it's 800 pages of philosopher after philosopher and what they thought of the human person. And so I think what people like John Paul II and Benedict understood was that actually the Catholic vision of the human person is something so much more exalted than any of the other alternatives on the intellectual smorgasbord.
Yeah.
And that's something we need Catholics to understand. And when you talk about Poland, Poles need to understand that Catholic Poland is something about which they should be proud, because even at its worst, it's so much better than nihilist Berlin. The Catholic vision of the human person is that we're made in the image and likeness of God. We are made to partake in the life and love of the Trinity. No Marxist can compete with that.
Absolutely. And you highlighting the significance of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, their legacies for today. When I was in 2009, I wanted to write my undergrad thesis on John Paul II. Particularly, it was the first several pages of Love and Responsibility. And I remember this was in the philosophy department, and I had to go, the school's personal list was, I think, on a sabbatical. And so they brought me to the school's phenomenologist. Now, I didn't know enough about philosophy to know what the reaction to John Paul II would be. But I came in thinking, okay, this is a Catholic department. I knew there was already some maybe hostilities, and so I'll go to this priest who's the school's phenomenologist, and we can then maybe read some of John Paul II together. Well, the priest didn't want to read anything of John Paul II, instead gave me Cartesian Meditations to read, which was quite helpful, but then I saw how different that was from John Paul II. So, and around this time, 2009, there still was a lot coming out on John Paul II, it seemed. But 10 years after that, it seemed like there was very, very little, at least in the Anglophone world being written on John Paul II. But recently, you mentioned Knights of Columbus in your talk, and they're paying for the collected works, the publishing of the collected works of John Paul II. And so they've just came out with Person and Act, new translation of that, and also the volume 2, which has, I believe, his dissertation or habilitation on Max Scheler. And so it's, I think in some ways, at least laying the grounds for a revival of studies of John Paul II. So maybe we can end on this. Why is John Paul II important to study, and what his significance for our age today?
Yeah. Well, I think that the core of the John Paul II pontificate intellectually was theological anthropology and moral theology. And of course, that has a huge impact upon marriage and family life. And I think to help our culture, to kind of to heal our culture, I think we need to heal the institution of the family. And I think he was the one who understood how to do that. I think he really is the Pope of the family. And I think that reading his philosophy is difficult. And there needs to be a bit of work done helping to unpack that for people who are not professional philosophers. But the whole work of that pontificate in developing the theological anthropology and the moral theology is just, I think, invaluable. He wanted the moral theology to be Christocentric, and an enormous amount of work was put into that project. And I think people who understood it and kind of adopted it, in many cases, they are the people who have created the strong Catholic families of today. And when you talk about the United States and what did Cardinal Pell mean by if the Americans hold firm, I think it's, he probably meant that, if those many Catholic couples who loved John Paul II and, say, went to World Youth Day in Denver and heard him talk about the theology of the body and embraced that teaching, had strong Catholic families which are now producing the vocations of this generation. If they all hold firm and don't kind of suffer from what some people call hero fatigue, when it's just like, oh no, not another tsunami that we have to fight, not another cultural battle that we have to fight. If they don't lose hope and if they hold firm, then there's some hope that Western civilization will recover and will become a kind of culture in which truth, beauty, and goodness can all play together. And so John Paul II is absolutely essential to the recovery. But you cannot pick up some of John Paul II's work and read it the way you can pick up some of Benedict. Anyone with a sort of BA can read Benedict. But John Paul II isn't that easy. And one project I'm working on at the moment is a John Paul II handbook to be published by Bloomsbury in London. And I think there'll be a number of Polish scholars helping me to put that together. Yes. And I'm hoping in that work to be able to explain John Paul II in a way that anyone with a BA can understand.
Well, on that hopeful note, we have to bring this podcast episode to an end. But Tracey, I want to thank you so much, and I look forward to this new handbook. I believe perhaps maybe even one of our friends who was once on the podcast with us, Michał Łuczewski, might be in this handbook.
I think he's going to be invited to contribute. Okay. Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well, I look forward to that. And so thank you. I just want to remind our listeners to please check out all of the other episodes, even our interview with Professor Michał Łuczewski. We're building quite a library. And everything is dedicated to the project of John Paul II and Pope Benedict, and also under the theme of hope. So on this note, thank you so much, Dr. Rowland.